So thank you, those of you who are putting on your videos. It's just much nicer for me. I really, really much nicer to be able to see you. First of all, I want to say that I hope that all of you are well, that your families are well, that your friends are well, and if anybody's been ill, that they're recuperating. I know that, as Anne was saying, you're having a harder time of it than we are here, and I'm really we're thinking about you a lot. So that's the first thing. And in a time like this, we got kind of two choices. We can either say, well, let's think about our experience. We're going through and find passages in the Torah that relate to it, or we can do the opposite. Or we can start from the opposite place. We can say, let's learn a piece of Torah, and the way we experience it is just going to be special because of what we're going through at the moment. But let's just choose a piece of Torah and see where it takes us and how we experience it. So that's what I really want to do at the moment. Great. Now, Lauren, I don't need it yet. So do me a kindness and take it down for a moment or put it on the side. I don't know if I can, and I'll tell you because you've got it. So you'll need to do it for me. I apologize. So I want to start with the 10 Commandments. It's coming up to Shavuot, and when Lauren asked me, and this had meant to be something either over Shavuot or right after Shavuot, so I wanted to do something that will start taking us toward Shavuot. It's almost like Ba'omer. And what I wanted to look at was something that's been interesting me for a long time, which is looking at the interplay between content and form in the 10 Commandments. I'm thinking here of musical or literary models. If you think of a symphony, you've got these different pieces, and yet you have motifs that come back and connect it. And somehow you have a full experience from something which had a slow movement and a fast movement and all kinds of different things going on. Or if you take a sonnet with the relationship between the last couplet and the rest of the poem. In other words, form can affect how we experience something, both intellectually and emotionally. And I want to take the 10 Commandments as a text, as a closed text, and think about how we can experience it when we allow form and content to play together. All right. So that's what I want to try to do. And first, I want to ask a few questions, deal with a few things first, and then we'll come to that. So there are a number of questions that we naturally ask about the 10 Commandments. Who were they for? Why these particular 10 Commandments and not other ones? What was the experience like with all that thunder and lightning and fire? Does that mean that, how did that affect how people experience getting the 10 Commandments? And most of what I'd like to focus on is going to be the creation of something called the 10 Commandments, which is much more than a conglomeration of a bunch of mitzvot. Now, there actually aren't exactly 10 Commandments, they're more. And the Hebrew is Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 speech forms or utterances. In English, it got the name 10 Commandments, and that's already a bit of a pity, because it's not exactly what the Hebrew called it. The Torah called it the 10 utterances, which actually has more than 10 commandments, but it's also leaving it more open that these are not only commandments, there's something else as well. So I want to start with some of the first questions and relate to them for a few minutes, just as a sort of introduction to where I want to get to. So the first question is, to whom and for whom were the 10 Commandments? Well, ostensibly, you're going to say to me, well, it's obvious. God gave them to the Jewish people when they came out of Egypt. The first one even starts, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. It's not who created the world or something like that, but I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And that's true. But it's not the whole story, because of course the 10 Commandments influenced human culture tremendously. And the rabbis talked about this. Now, when I use the word rabbis, I don't mean the rabbis of today. It's a kind of not very good term for what's called in Hebrew Chazal, Chachamenu, their blessed memory, are sages. Maybe I'll use the word sages. It means the rabbis of the period from 0 to 500 CE. The time of the Mishnah and the time of the Talmud, and the time of much of the creation of what we call Midrash, which is what I'm going to use. So the rabbis, the sages, they thought that the Ten Commandments had a sort of dual role. And what, for instance, the Midrash Mechilta says, why were they given in the desert? So no one group could come and say, these are just ours. They're not for you. They were given in the desert. A desert, it's a place where anybody can pass through, anybody can take something. Or, for instance, they thought that there was a lot of parallel between the Ten Commandments and the 7 Noahide commandments, which was a tradition of things that Noah had already been taught. So the Ten Commandments have a very interesting role in terms of us and in terms of the world. Now, why these 10? Well, that also depends what we think the 10 Commandments were there for. But why these 10 Commandments and not other ones? And I think there are at least 3 serious theories. One theory is that these are the most basic utterances, commandments that we need to create our own individual beings, to create a society. These are the most basic things. Another understanding is this is what the Jews needed when they just got out of Egypt, right? So, for instance, there's no kashrut in the 10 Commandments. Well, kashrut's pretty important to Jewish life, but it isn't there. Well, maybe they didn't need it yet because they were eating the man every day. Who needs kashrut at that moment yet? So there's a question about why these. It might be these are the most basic. It might be these are the ones we needed at that moment. Or a third theory is that these are really the headlines for all of halakha, for all of Jewish law. And that if you look carefully, you could put all of Jewish law into these 10 categories. So not only I'm not going to call them 10 commandments, I'm not going to call them 10 utterances either. I'm going to call them 10 aspects of Judaism. Now, quite a few Jewish thinkers, the Ramban, Philo, number of Jewish thinkers went and tried to say, okay, let's look at all of the Jewish law of Sajigon and try to categorize it according to these 10 commandments. And the interesting thing is they came out with such different answers. Like, where would you put kashrut? Well, Rabban put almost everything in the first utterance. I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. He put everything there because then there's love God and fear God and everything. Philo, where did he put kashrut? He put it in the last one, do not covet. Because he said not to covet is not only about not wanting what somebody else has, it's about being able to restrain yourself from wanting everything out there. So very, very different perceptions of how you would see these as 10 categories for Jewish law. Now, another thing that the Midrash was very strong about was an idea that you wouldn't necessarily pick up when you read the text. But the first verse after the 10 Commandments says, V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. The whole people are literally seeing the voices. Now that could refer to the thunder and lightning that they're seeing, or it could refer to God, the voices coming from God. They were apprehending, we would say, because they're not visually seeing the voices necessarily, and they're all apprehending the voices. And if it's the sound of the 10 Commandments, why is it voices in the plural? And the Midrash says because everybody heard the 10 Commandments differently. Like if a woman was pregnant, you didn't want her to hear it too loud and frightening because she could lose the baby, as against some lout who needed to hear it really strong. And you could say that about the content as well. If you have a commandment like don't steal, well, a person in the inner city and an employee and an employer, they all hear that, and a student who's about to take an exam and dying to cheat, they all hear do not steal differently. Nobody hears it exactly the same. It depends on your background, depends on the circumstances you're living in as to what you hear for do not steal. Or respect your parents. Well, it depends. Everybody's got a different set of parents and a different chemistry between them and their parents. And for each person, a mitzvah like respect your parents, a completely different mitzvah, completely different experience. So everybody hears the 10 Commandments differently. Then and now. Now I want to get to where I most want to be, which is in this question of form and content. Now, the the traditional picture that we have of the Ten Commandments, which in a lot of synagogues, I was going to bring one, a pretty one, but I didn't find one that I like, is of course of two stone tablets rounded at the top. I don't know how they became rounded at the top in the Torah. You can't see anything about being rounded at the top, but that's how they got, right? With 5 of the commandments on one and 5 on the other. Yes, is that what you've seen in shuls and all? That's our usual picture. And that's the picture I want you to have. 5 on the one side, 5 on one and 5 on the other. The Midrash says that's how they think it was. At least that's one of the theories. First 5 commandments on one, the second 5 on the other. Now, what does that do for us if we put 5 and 5? And I want to suggest 3 ways of apprehending the form of the Ten Commandments. So here I want to ask you, Lauren, a favor, and would you put on the share screen this not very pretty but useful chart? Can you put it on the share screen? Because I won't be able to do it once you've done it. Right. Right. Have we got it there? Can you put it up? Or you can put it in the chat and it'll be there all the time. Great. Oh no, it's not sitting well. Okay, it'll do. Now, if you take a look at it, what have we got here? Let's say this column on the, now I won't be able to point, but if you could take a look at the column, can you give us the one with Hebrew and English, Lauren? If you keep on going, there's one with Hebrew and English. Can you move it to that one? Ah, wonderful, thank you. Here we've got it, okay? Now, here we've got it, the 10 Commandments, up here, Exodus 22 to 15. Now, if you look on the right, if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, but on the right column, you've got, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, etc. You shall have no other gods. Can you see that there? Somebody, yes. Okay,
yes, yes.
Okay, right. Now, what you can see here is that you've got on one side, I've put the first, and on the other side, the other, but it's going like the Hebrew. So the right has got the first 5, and the left has got the second 5, and on the all the way on the right of the screen, there's the ending, but don't worry about that for now. Let's take a look at this, what we've got here. Now, here we were imagining 2 big stones, yes? And we imagined something that was reasonably even, but if you look at it, you can see right away, it's totally lopsided from the amount of language, right? Completely lopsided. And of course, that's not by mistake, that's on purpose, but what is that about? So that's the first thing you can see. The second thing you can see is that the first few are clearly about, we could call them faith mitzvot, about our relationship with God. What in Hebrew they call bein adam lamakom, between the human being and God. So the first one is, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Of course, that's not in a language of, at all, in language of a commandment. It's an utterance. But it's a commandment to be in a relationship with God, to believe in God, to intellectually think about God, to be in a relationship with God. The second one is not to, lo yelecha Elohim acharim. You have no other gods beside me. Then it says not to make them. But the first aspect is you don't have anything else that's a God for you besides God. The third one is, Lauren, if you can point to them as I do them, that would be amazing. The third one is not to take God's name falsely. So we have 3 that are about one's relationship with God. The first is an awareness of a relationship with God. The second is not sharing that with something else, but a relationship with God that is really totally with God. And the third is how you relate in language to God's name, okay? The 4th commandment down here is to remember the Sabbath and to keep it. Okay, that's also a commandment that has to do with my relationship with God. What's the Sabbath about? Right? That God made the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. And the Sabbath is my testifying, my relationship with God about this, that he created the world, my awareness that he created the world. The 5th one is a kind of bridging, which is respect your parents, which is a kind of bridge between these and what's coming in the second half. It's a sort of intermediary mitzvah. And the mitzvot of Shabbat and keep respecting your parents tend to come together. In last week's Parsha, which was Kedoshim, in chapter 19, it's all there about it. And there they come together all the time. Shabbat and respecting your parents. So we're going to have to maybe think about what is that relationship. And then we've got what we call between human beings. Let's call it the ethical mitzvot. If we call these more the faith mitzvot and call these ones the ethical. So we've got lo tirtzach, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness, and at the end, not to covet, which is maybe the key to the whole thing. Now, we could have had lots of details about do not murder. The same way we had lots of details about Shabbat, we could have had lots of details about not murdering. There's lots of details later in the next, in Mishpatim, the next piece that we read. There could have been lots of details about not to steal, not to kidnap, what happens if you do steal. But the Ten Commandments haven't got those details. And I feel, I hear Beethoven's Fifth when I look at this or hear this. I really feel Beethoven's Fifth with lo titzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov, da-da-da-da. There's a kind of, we don't want to discuss details now. You must hear these as principles. That you've got to hear lo tirtzach as a principle. Don't murder, don't steal. Later we can get into nuances, when it might be appropriate to take human life, when it might be appropriate to take something from somewhere else. But first, you need to see it as a principle. Later, there might be exceptions. There might be nuances. But first and foremost, look at this. Now it's on this side. Great. First and foremost, it's a principle. So we have lots of detail in the discussion of the mitzvot which are only between God and humanity. And then tremendous focus when it gets to these. It's getting lovelier and lovelier. Thank you. Tremendous focus when you get to the 5 mitzvot, which are more ethical mitzvot, which are between people. They're short, they're clipped, and they're focused. Later we come to nuance, but we've got to really get the idea for starters. We've got to hear them completely for starters first. So this is one way to read it. I've got 2 columns. I've got 2 tablets of stone. There's a lot of difference between them. They're both basic to my being as a Jew and as a human being. They're both basic to create a society, but they're very different tablets of stone. And that's one way to read them. But the Midrash suggested, the Mechilta, which is very early Midrash, the people in it, the rabbis in it are the same as in the Mishnah, people like Rabbi Akiva there. They said, you know what? Let's not only read it as 2 tablets, let's also read it horizontally. Let's try and read it horizontally. In which case, what are we going to do? We're going to say, what's happened here? It's moved. People still see it? We're going to say, we're going to read it horizontally. Then I'm going to read the 1st and the 6th, the 2nd and the 7th, the 3rd and the 8th. I'm going to read them across. What's that going to do for me, trying to read them horizontally? It's going to give me a chance to think about whether there's an interplay between the 1st and the 2nd tablet. Do we see them as 2 very different aspects of our relationship with God? Or do we say, no, there's something between those, and they affect them, and that the 2nd column is informed by the 1st and vice versa? So let's start with the first top, the top of it. Lo tirtzach, do not murder, is informed by Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord who took you out of Egypt. How? So the Mechilta here says, let's take an example. Let's tell a parable. You have a king, and he enters the kingdom. And what does he do? Well, he makes a whole lot of sculptures of himself. He puts out coins with his face on them. This doesn't have to be a king. Can be 20th century dictators and 20th century democracies. Yes, who's on the coins? Who's on the statues? the king or the leader. And after a while, what do the people do? They knock down the statues. They rub out the coins or stop using those. What's the effect? First of all, why did they do it? Well, I mean, we saw that very often in the 20th century, especially people would, let's say, knock down, when people knock down a statue of Stalin. Why did they knock it down? Lahavdil, of course. Why did they knock down a statue of Stalin? They knocked it down because they wanted to say, you are not a hero for us. You are not a leader for us. We don't want a relationship with you. We don't want to see this statue staring us in the face. And right now in the United States, there are fascinating things going on. I don't know if you have a parallel in England at the moment with statues, for instance, of Confederate leaders in the South, which are anathema for the Black community, and people asking to knock them down and sometimes going and knocking them down. So to knock down these statues or to rub out the images on the coins is to do something very dramatic. So the people go and do that. Okay, that's the parable. What's that got to do with the 10 Commandments? Because, says the Midrash, if you murder, that's what you're doing. Every human being was created in the image of God. If you, God forbid, murder somebody, you are knocking down God's image in this world. You're destroying God's image in this world. It's like knocking down that statue of that leader, or facing the coin, rubbing out the image of the leader on the coin. Every human being is in God's image. So you can't be in a full relationship with God if you murder. Because being in a relationship with God is accepting and acknowledging and trying to really somehow assimilate that every human being is in God's image. That's not easy. And of course, if we turn it the other way around, if you save life, and here I'm really thinking of our time now, I'm thinking of doctors and nurses and all the people and carers, yes, who are out there saving life. If you are saving life, that's part of your relationship with God, because each one of those lives are made in the image of God. So the saving of life is an aspect of your relationship with God. It's not just something separate. It's part of a relationship with God. And I think also at this time, when one has to make very big decisions as to how one, with the pandemic, how one evaluates how to act. I'm not coming to say there's a particular only one right decision or wrong decision, but the decision-making process is part of our relationship with God. An ethical process trying to evaluate how we make decisions about life versus livelihood and questions like that, and people maybe getting ill versus people being cooped up and being abused. These kind of questions are part of our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then part of our service of God. They are a deep part of being aware of God. They're not a separate thing. That's what they wanted to say. Read it across. Don't only read it as two separate pieces of stone with two separate bunches of ideas. No. Also read it across. And they keep on going. And it's not hard to do for English speakers, because the second, if we read the second one and the sixth, well, what do we have? We have idolatry and adultery. And in English, they even sound similar. And what are they? They're two forms of disloyalty to a deep relationship, right? Because idolatry and adultery are both letting go of a deep, real relationship to move into other relationships. A total letting go of a loyalty and in depth of a relationship. And, of course, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, that's seen as an imagery for our relationship with God. So there's a tremendous amount in Tanakh already of seeing the relationship with God, using what we know about relationships with people to help us try to imagine our relationship and move emotionally into our relationship with God. So sometimes the first column enriches the second column, and sometimes the second column enriches the first column. And we go on, we can go, and I also think you don't have to read exactly horizontally. You can take a look and say, for me, number 3, which is about taking God's name in vain, that connects to me to number 9, not being a false witness. Yes? You don't have to read them exactly horizontally either, but you have to try to play and be aware of relationships between the two sides. Now, the Midrash, when it read number 3 and number 8, not to take God's name in vain, not to lie when you take God's name, and not to steal, what it said was, well, that's also in a verse in this last week's Parsha, where it says, don't steal, and don't deny, and don't lie, and don't swear falsely. If you steal, you might end up being pressured to lie, to swear falsely. If you deny something, if stealing can be, you find an object and then you don't want to tell, or all kinds of small issues. You can start with something small and it grows and grows and grows into something very difficult and can come all the way to swearing falsely. There's another way of looking at the connection between them, which is that taking God's name falsely is a kind of stealing, because you're trying to use God's name to back up something which isn't so. It's stealing God's name for your own purposes. The fourth line, well, the Sabbath and false witness. And on this, the Midrash felt very strongly. If you keep Shabbat, you're testifying that God created the world. And if you don't keep Shabbat, you're not testifying that. And we have that in the Bible quite often, that keeping Shabbat is seen as testimony that God created the world. But you don't have to keep it just to that. You can look at a lot of times where in life, making a religious decision feels like testifying. It's not just that little decision. You're saying something larger by doing it. The rabbis say in Yoma, who really desecrates God's name? Somebody who people know of as a religious person, and then they do something dishonest. That's really a desecration of God's name. Because people say, oh, what's the point of learning Torah? Look what it did for that guy. So seeing what your actions as a way of testifying about something is something that can affect all one's actions. Can be a little scary, but it's there. Now, the one that actually, as I've seen, has aroused the most interest is reading the last line horizontally. And like I say, you don't have to specially read them this way horizontally. What you need to do is begin to play with the relationship between the two sides. This is just, Midrash is there not to close down possibilities, but to open them up. So if the Midrash says, let's suggest reading them across, you don't have to read them only across. It's just a suggestion to get you going to see relationships between them. So, because if we say they're here not just as 10 different particular mitzvot, but as a work of art that's been created by these 10 mitzvot, then we want to try to see them in different ways. So let's take the last line. Respect your parents and not to covet. Now, in the past, when I've put this on the table, I've had the most lively discussion about this. And it's a little harder with Zoom because we never know if we unmute, if we get a whole lot of noise as well. But you should feel comfortable to unmute if you have something to say. So is there a relationship between them? So the Midrash goes in a particular direction, which is, well, if you covet, the continuation of coveting is your neighbor's wife as well. And if you end up coveting other people in other relationships, you will destroy the family unit. Your children can respect their parents if they, A, know who their parents are for sure, and B, if there's a sense of family to their parents, if their parents have been satisfied and created somehow a unit and a family unit, then that can create the stage for respecting the parents. But it had to start with the parents. So that's been one understanding. Another understanding which I've liked very much, which a psychologist put on the table. Actually, many years ago when I lived in England, and I was sitting in Yakar in England, and we had a group of psychologists looking at the Ten Commandments. And one of them put on the table the idea that your parents, the most basic thing your parents need to do for you is help you to feel whole. And if you feel whole, then you don't have this problem of coveting. And one of the places where it starts is a child feeling that they can accept their parents. Accepting your parents is like somehow feeling that you can't accept your parents with all their imperfections is the first step to feeling whole. Because if you can't accept your parents, well, you are a bit your parents. They're inside you. They're a piece of you, of who you are, both historically and genetically. And if there's not an ability to accept your parents, then there'll be a lifelong tussle with lo tachmod, with not coveting. In other words, the first place to start is accepting your parents, accepting the family you came in, you grew up in, accepting that home and making that something good, after which you needn't then want the things that are outside yourself, the things that are somebody else's. You can admire them, you can try to do similar things, but you don't desperately need what belongs to somebody else, because you've created a wholeness. And the last line is about creating this wholeness, which then you can give back to your parents. So what you do if you didn't have it and how do you create it, that's tremendous work. But that's just the beginning of how one can see the form of the Ten Commandments affecting our perception of the content of it. That is, whether it's the first line or the fourth line or the fifth line, there's a sense of movement between this first half, which is all about these long discussions of my relationship with God and a long discussion, to these sharp clipped ethical commandments, but actually you've got to read them across as well. You've got to feel the relationships between them. So Laura, now I want to ask you a favor. If you would take this off so we can all see each other. Can you do that for me? Great. And I want to think of another way of perceiving the Ten Commandments, but I'm depending on the fact that both we really know the Ten Commandments and you've been looking at them now so that we can just envision them now. So now if we just envision the Ten Commandments, or if you've got a chumash, you can look, or if you want to look on the chat, has the chat got a link now? So now if we think of the Ten Commandments, I want to think of another, and think music now as well, and poetry, please. Let's start from the first and move into the second, third, fourth to the eighth, and then ninth and 10th. So now I'm not keeping it in two columns anymore necessarily. I'm starting with the first second as sort of one beginning, then the third, then the fourth through the eighth, then the ninth, and then the 10th. So let's see what we can do. What are the first two about? Where do they take place? Internally. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, God is saying to us, I'm your God. I took you out of Egypt to be in a relationship with you. That's the first one. The second one is, Lo yelecha Elohim achirim. Don't have another God. Then it's also don't make idols and whatever. But nowadays we're not so into making idols. But we have plenty of difficulty in keeping the relationship with God a particular relationship without depending on all kinds of other things. So that's the first, that's the beginning, and it's internal. It might be emotional to be in a relationship with God. It might be more intellectual, but it's internal. It's essentially internal. Then we come to the third one. What's the third one? Not to take God's name in vain. Speech. It's not only internal, it matters how you say it. It matters how you talk about God. It matters how you talk about people. It matters how you talk to people, right? But it matters how you talk about God. That's the third commandment. So it's not only about what's happening inside you, but it's also about speech. The fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and the eighth include emotion. They include speech. After all, you can murder somebody with speech. Yes, you can condemn somebody to death, but they're essentially action. Shabbat is what you feel about it. It's remembering Shabbat, and it's also remembering Shabbat with Kiddush. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. It's also saying, making Kiddush. But it's also Shamor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, which is not doing work. So you're moving to a mitzvah which incorporates very strongly emotion or intellect, speech, and action, or withdrawal from action. Kabedet avicha ve'et imecha was seen as having a number of aspects. As we would say in English, respect your parent. Well, what does that mean? It means to feel respect, to be in a kind of relationship. It means to act respectfully. It means to not do certain things and yes do. It means to speak a certain kind of way. In other words, it's a mitzvah which actually has all of them. And then we move to these exceedingly active, action-based mitzvahs, which are also put in such an active kind of low, clipped way. Lo titzach, don't murder. Lo tinaf, don't commit adultery. Again, you can do that by speech, but generally it's an action mitzvah. And lo tignov, which means don't steal, don't kidnap, don't take from another. And those are very action-based. So we've got now, think music, yes, we've got a movement from something very internal out to speech, out to action that's very related to speech and thought, and then to action, which is straight action, which is the sort of thing people get up and do without thought very often, or sometimes premeditated. And then number 9, where's number 9? Back to speech. Don't bear false witness. That's not speech with God. How you speak about God, how you use God's name, that's speech with people. That's having an effect on other people through speech. Don't take God's name falsely that's number 3. And in a kind of way, that's related to number 9, which is don't bear false witness, which is the way you can really hurt people in speech. And again, we need to turn these the other way around as well. What can you do positively with speech? In the same way as lo titzach, do not murder, needs to be turned around to save life. Yes, they all have their positive side as well. And the last one moves all the way back into the person with do not covet. Yes, not to, and here it's a very hard mitzvah, right? The rabbis understood that you actually didn't really go against that prohibition if you just want what somebody else has. Somebody else has a swimming pool in their backyard and you're dying for a swimming pool in the backyard. Well, you need to work on yourself emotionally. But the problem is when you try and it's really hard to take the swimming pool, but when you try to get it out of their hands. In other words, you haven't actually gone over the prohibition till you try to get it from them. I'll give you an example where people go over that prohibition in when a neighborhood, it's happened here, it starts to gentrify and somebody wants somebody's house and they try to convince them that they don't want it anymore. Yes, that really they'd love to move to an old age home because what do they want to run an apartment themselves? And they try to convince them that they don't want to live in that house anymore. In order to buy that house, that's really going over not to covet, right? Because you've gone and done something. You didn't steal anything. You didn't kill anybody, but you've pushed somebody out of somewhere where they wanted to be. So that's when you actually can get punished for the prohibition. But the source of it is internal. The way the 10 Commandments gives it to you is something internal, not to covet, to work on having a sense of wholeness and not needing something that somebody else has. Or in Philo's understanding, not even somebody else's, even kashrut in Philo's understanding ends up in do not covet. So we've started inside the human being in the sense of belief in God or sense of God. It doesn't say you have to believe in God. It says, Anochi Hashem Elokeh, here I am. It's an utterance, not a commandment. Here I am, says God. I've taken you out of Egypt for a relationship. I'm waiting for that relationship. And don't be disloyal to that relationship. And then it's how you speak about me, to me, and about me. And that can include prayer as well. Yes, on its flips positive side. And then it moves to these mitzvot, which are very intertwined, feeling, speech, and action, which are Shabbat and relationship to parents. And then to these very generally, very action type of those three that are about action, and then back to speech, and then sort of comes back into ourselves. And we're left at the end of the 10 Commandments back in ourselves, trying to find that space in ourselves. And in terms of our time now, where the whole balance between how much was outward and how much is being inward now, how much we're out there on the streets, how much we're at home, how much we're doing things that are out, and how much we're doing things that are quieter on our own. In that balance, I feel that it's a time to really look at that rhythm of the internal and the external and work on it and see where's God in our lives inside that internal and external. I think in a time of upheaval like now, it's sometimes a time though that we can use to actually ask some of those questions about the relationship, the dynamics between the internal speech and action, and where one influences the other, where action sometimes influences our speech or our thought processes, and where our emotions and our thought processes influence our speech and our action. So I felt that I wanted to share that with you. And I want to give you a chance now, because it's easier maybe at the end when we're on Zoom, if anybody would like to ask a question, make a suggestion about another idea of the interplay between these different columns or different commandments, or in any other way, contribute something. So would you like to unmute yourself if you'd like to? Anybody? Don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to say something. Otherwise, come on, Anne. Anne, I want you to, come on, I'm inviting you. Take off your mute, Anne, and tell me what you have to say.
That's not fair.
No.
That's not cool. I go second. Okay. I need a second to think. I had something, but I've got to remember it. Gilla. Anyone else there, out there in England?
Anybody else want to say something? Did you have something? Lindy, did you want to say something? Yes.
I loved your example. First of all, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful symphony that you've created here. It's very lovely, very different. And it resonates. I love the idea about convincing someone that they need to move out of their house because they've reached the stage of life where it would be better for them to be somewhere else. And that is, even without doing anything except influencing their own decision, it's Genevas Das. You have actually stolen their mind. Yes. Because in suggesting this, the auto-suggestion, the power of just causing some kind of ripple on the river of their thinking about, well, yes, you know, I was finding life difficult at home, and maybe I should be in a more protected, supported environment, etc. And in the end, it's their decision, so you didn't do anything.
That's right. Yes.
Not the house.
Yes, I'm not saying that that's always a wrong decision, but if it's coming from the wrong motive and it's just for yourself, then it can be a very wrong decision.
Yes, no,
very wrong thing to do.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I saw you smiling at the time. I want to, Anne, you want to say something before I bring things through?
No, I was very, before you said what you're saying, I was just thinking that your self-identity is really accepting your self-identity. I mean, you put it in terms of wholeness, but understanding who you are is so core to the last pairing. And that in very many ways, if we're made in God's image, which takes you back to the beginning, it's understanding that wholeness of the whole thing coming together.
Wonderful, thank you, yes, thank you. I feel that. I feel that that you don't really understand one of those commandments without the other. they inform each other, and then you begin to get a sense of what you're being tried to create your own identity, and awareness that you're in God's image, and awareness that you're related to your parents, and all these different things help you to create an identity, which will hopefully make it possible for you to move along life without needing the other things, and being able to create your own authentic identity. I want to, before we close, there's an idea that you begin with thanking your hosts, but I wanted to do it at the end, and to thank both Lindy and Lauren. I know Lindy for so many years, and it's for me a really very special thing to be invited to join you and to join Lauren. And I want to thank Lauren for her totally undeserved and kind words. But it really is for me a wonderful experience to come back to a relationship with the Levines, and for some of you that I know from before, and with those of you who I didn't know before, to create a relationship. And I think every place where you learn Torah has a difference in terms of, and there's something that each different community adds, and no other community can add to Torah learning. There's an idea that not only did everybody hear the commandments differently, but everybody received each person received some aspect of Torah for them to develop. And that's why everybody has to learn Torah. Because otherwise you could say, what do we bother? Let's give it to a couple of geniuses. Let them sit and learn Torah all day, and there'll be Torah in the world, and we can go home. Well, now we are home. But the idea is that every person received, when we got the 10 Commandments, some aspect of Torah which is theirs to develop. And if they don't, the world is missing that. And it just won't be in the world. Every person has some ideas or some way of looking at something or some way of feeling something in Torah that is only they can do. And that was something that's a gift, and that is God's gift to them, but it's also their gift to the world when they learn Torah and share. So I want to really thank Lindy and Lauren for inviting me, and all of you for joining me. And I'm sorry that it was so hard to actually study together because of the problem of unmuting all the time. But if anybody wants to throw in any idea, thinks of something afterwards that's connected, Lauren can give you my email, and we can be in contact. So I wish you all good weeks, healthy weeks, and when it comes to time, wonderful Shavuot in which you have a sense of creativity. And I think we're pretty much hitting the 10 o'clock, so thanks, Claudia.
Thank you so much. The last word to Lindy in a second, but I think you've given us so much to think about. So it's great that we have this year now, where we've still got a few weeks that we can actually still, think about everything, which is great. And of course, the final idea, which I think leaves us all with something quite empowering to take away. So please, God, this will be the first of reconnecting with you, and really thank you so much for coming to learn with us.
Really my pleasure. All the best.
Thank you, Lauren.
Lindy.
Yes.
Thank you, Gilla.
Gilla, all I can say is that you are like old wine. Whatever you say, of course, has such content and depth and originality. And it stirs us to new thought, which has always been your gift and your talent. And you're because Torah is inside you, and the learning comes from within, and we are just hugely privileged to be.
I look forward to a chance to be in a situation where I can hear more from you, because that's always most exciting. So again, if anybody has any ideas and they want to send them, feel free, not only free, but invited to do so that we can continue the discussion. Okay.